Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be walking you through my process for painting Night Lords. This is a scheme that I've used across my own personal army for the Horus Heresy, but I think it should work equally well for any 40k Chaos Space Marine force. I hope you enjoy the video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for future videos, and let's get into it. So this is our subject for today's video. He's a bit of a mishmash of parts from my bits box, and I've tried to combine parts from the Horus Heresy kits, as well as some Chaos Space Marine elements, so hopefully this should be useful regardless of which system you play. So to begin with, I'm just giving him a couple of thin coats of black primer through the airbrush, just allowing it to dry in between coats, before moving on to some pre-shading. So for the first pre-shade, I'm just going to be using this cool grey ink from De La Rowney, and I'm just applying a few thin coats through the airbrush. Make sure you allow it to dry properly in between coats. You can use a hairdryer to speed up the process if you need to. And it's worth mentioning that this is a mixture 50-50 ink to airbrush thinner, just so we can build up some nice thin coats. You could use a grey primer for this instead if you prefer, but I like to use the ink because I think it gives a smoother finish and it's much less prone to clogging up the airbrush. And then we're just going to repeat the process using white ink. We're just going to try and hit the very top of the model and just the areas where the light would catch. Again, a few thin coats through the airbrush, just make sure you allow it to dry properly in between. And this should give us a really nice foundation to add some colour. Next, we're going to be using some blue ink from scale 75, and I've diluted this quite heavily. This is around 4 parts airbrush thinner to 1 part ink. The reason for that is the pigment in this ink is really intense, and the aim of this is to build up some really thin coats so that we can get a nice smooth finish. And for this stage, I'm giving it 2 coats of that thinned mixture, just allowing it to dry properly in between. I'm then going to switch to violet ink from scale 75, and I'm just going to apply a thin coat of this from underneath just to add some purple into the shadows. This is around 3 parts airbrush thinner to 1 part ink. We're then moving back to our thinned blue ink mixture, and we're going to give the model a couple more thin coats, just allowing it to dry properly in between. And this is what he looks like when he's not under the super bright lights of the airbrush station. As you can see, a really nice smooth finish. We've got some purple in the shadows. It gives us a really nice base to work from. I'm now switching to a more precise airbrush. So this is the Harder and Steenbeck Infinity, and it's the version with the 0.15mm nozzle. And what we're attempting to do here is just place some very fine white lines just in the areas where we want to paint our lightning patterns. If you prefer, you can brush paint the lightning patterns on by hand prior to doing this stage, and that will give you a guide as to where to spray. To be honest, I messed that stage up a little bit. I forgot to turn the PSI down on my compressor after cleaning it out before spraying the white ink, so the lines came out a lot thicker than they usually do. But we'll come and fix that in a minute. It's not too much of a problem. I'm now using some electric blue fluorescent paint from scale 75, and I'm just going to give those areas that we've just sprayed a couple of thin coats, thinned about 50-50 with airbrush thinner, and it just gives a nice OSL effect just to those areas where we're going to paint lightning in just a moment. Usually I wouldn't do this step, but because I messed up the white lines with the airbrush a little bit, I'm just coming in with some Talisar blue contrast, and I'm just going over those areas by hand, just because there's a few kind of white speckles that I'm not very happy with, so I'm just kind of using this to blend those in a bit more to the previous blue. After that, I'm just going to come in with some black metal from scale 75, and I'm just going to base coat all of the silver areas on the model. Next, we're going to do the same, but for all the gold parts, and for this I'm using decayed metal from scale 75. Next, I'm just going to be going over all of the areas on the model that I want to be black, and I'm going to be giving it a base coat of scale 75 Eclipse Grey. So this is going to be all of the soft armor joints, the gun casing, handle, and any other areas you want to be black. So things like the grenades and that sort of thing. Just realised I've missed a bit of gold trim here, so I'm just coming back with the decayed metal just to fill in those areas that I missed. Then for all of those areas that we just painted with the Eclipse Grey, I'm just going to come in and give it a very rough highlight of Graphene Grey, again from scale 75. Not being too precise with this, just trying to get it on the raised areas. It's going to all be glazed over in just a moment anyway, so don't worry about being too precise. Just try and keep it fairly neat. I'm now just adding a little bit of white paint to that graphene grey that we've just been using, and I'm just giving a final highlight to all of those areas that we want to be black. It does make them end up looking a little bit bright, but we're going to be coming and glazing those back down in a minute, so they will end up a lot darker. And then to finish off those black areas, we're just going to come in with a glaze, which is going to be a mixture of contrast medium and black Templar contrast paint. It's going to be mostly medium, so you want probably 3 to 4 drops of medium for every drop of paint, and then just come in and give a thin coat of that all over the areas that we've just painted. Next up, it's time to start painting our lightning patterns on. So for this, I'm using Blue Horror from Games Workshop. Apologies for the focus issues in this section. Hopefully you can still kind of see what I'm doing in the background. But I'm just kind of painting a series of straight lines in a kind of forking pattern, trying to keep each line straight and then kind of fork off in a different direction. And we're just doing this over the areas that we'd previously sprayed that glow effect with the airbrush. You could do it without the glow effect, it would still look good. So if you're not comfortable doing kind of really precise airbrush lines, you could do it without that. or you could just leave the lightning off altogether. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and the scheme would still look good without it. So the paint's quite thin here, it's quite translucent, so once I've sketched on the initial pattern, just coming back in with the same paint and just kind of reinforcing those lines just to make them look a little bit more prominent. And then once you're happy with the overall pattern, we're going to come in with some white paint. I'm using this titanium white from Pro Acryl. You just use any white paint that you've got in your collection. And I'm basically doing a white dot at each point where the lightning changes direction. So any of the intersections, just do a little white kind of dot. You can extend it a little bit past the intersection if you want to. And what I'm doing now is I'm just coming back in with the blue horror that we used to originally paint those lines on with, and I've thinned it quite heavily with water. And I'm just kind of glazing over those areas where we just did the white kind of intersections, and it just blends it into the previous pattern. There's definitely more realistic ways that you can paint lightning than this, but I think it gives a really nice effect. It stands out really nice on the tabletop as well. Next, we're going to be using Corn Red from Citadel, and we're going to be using this to base coat the wings of the emblem on the shoulder pad. I'd also recommend painting the eye lenses of the helmet. I forgot to do that here, but we will be using the same colour for that later on, so for the sake of efficiency, it would make much more sense to do it now. I'm then going to be using some Airbrush Earth shade just to wash over those wings on the shoulder pad. And then I'm going to be using some dark brown from scale 75 just to base coat all of the bone areas on the model. I'm then also going to give those a wash of Airbrush Earth shade. For the sake of efficiency, it would probably be easier to base coat the red, then base coat all of the bone, and then you can wash it all together. I'm then going to come back in with a Corn Red, and I'm just going to go over the previous layer that we put the Airbrush Earth shade wash on, and just leave the darker areas in the recesses. So our first highlight for the red is going to be using Mayhem Red, scale 75. I'm just going over the raised areas just to start to build up the vibrancy. To follow that up, we're going to be using some Bahirit Red from scale 75, and we're just going to be doing a finer highlight just to push that colour a little bit more. I'm then going to add a small amount of Mauve White into the Bahirit Red and just do a final highlight just on the very raised areas of the emblem. I've then just added a touch more of that mauve white into the mix, and I'm just painting the very extremities. And then just to bring some richness back to this red section, I'm just going to be giving it a contrast glaze. So this is going to be 4 parts contrast medium, 1 part Flesh Terrors red, and then a tiny amount of Black Templar contrast, not even 1 part, so just to darken it a tiny bit. But then coming back to our Thar brown, and we're just going to go over all of those bone areas again, just leaving the dark areas in the recesses. We're then going to mix some mauve white into the Thar brown that we're already using, approximately 50-50 mix. We're just going to hit the upper areas, leaving that existing colour towards the recesses. Just as a final highlight on the bone, we're just going to take some pure mauve white and we're just going to pick out the extremities. To highlight the silver areas, we'll just be taking some thrash metal from scale 75. We're just doing a rough highlight over all of the silver. Not being too particular with this, just using a kind of stippling motion just to add a bit of brightness to that silver. Apologies for the lack of focus here. Camera seemed to not want to focus on this axe for some reason. But I'm just doing a stippling motion just to give that beaten metal effect. And then moving on to some heavy metal, again from scale 75. We're just repeating the process, but in a lighter manner, just kind of hitting the upper areas. For a final highlight on the silver, we're going to be using speed metal from scale 75. This is a really bright silver paint, so you don't want to overdo it with this. Just hit the very edges and it just adds some reflections to the edges of that metal. We'll then be taking some Viking gold from scale 75. We'll just be going over all of those areas that we painted with the decayed metal earlier in the process. Just try and leave that previous colour towards the recesses. For the final highlight on the gold, we'll be taking some citrine alchemy from scale 75. We'll just be hitting all of the edges of that gold armour. This is a really light gold paint, and I think it gives a really nice contrast against those darker colours in the shadows. Next, it's time to hit all the edges of that blue armour, and I'm going to be using Fenrisian Grey from Games Workshop for this. I'll be honest, this isn't a quick process. There aren't really any shortcuts for it. I guess the only shortcut would be to not do it, or do less of it. You could just hit the prominent edges. I think that would still look good, but I think it really does add something to the model when kind of each of those separations in the armour has got kind of a very subtle highlight to it. Keeping the paint very thin here. I've got it on a wet palette at the moment just to ensure that it doesn't dry out and start going clumpy or chalky or anything like that. You want it to be nice and fluid, quite thin, but not too thin, if that makes sense. You still want it to be fairly opaque, but you want it to flow nicely across those edges. I think in real time, this probably takes around about 20 minutes or so per marine. So if you're painting a squad or even a whole army, yes, it's going to take a while, but I do really think it's worth it. If you don't want to spend this amount of time on each model, totally understandable. What I'd probably do if I was trying to do a faster paint job on this one is I'd probably hit just the prominent edges, just the most visible ones. So like the tops of the kind of like the lower leg armor, the tops of the helmet, the greaves, the edges of the shoulder pads and the top of the backpack, maybe things like that. You get a similar effect. Next up, we'll be painting the eye lenses, and we'll be using Corn Red and Pallid Witch Flesh from Citadel. If you haven't already done so, give the eye lenses a quick coat of Corn Red. And then what we're going to do is we're going to mix in some Pallid Witch Flesh into the Corn Red, give them a general highlight kind of towards the middle of the lens. And then once that's dry, we're going to come back in with some pure Pallid Witch Flesh and just do a small highlight towards the middle of the lens before moving on to the next stage. And then to make the eye lenses pop, we're going to use some Red Ecstasy fluorescent paint from scale 75. And we're just going to do a couple of thin coats over the entire eye lens. We're also going to get a little bit of it around the edges as well. And this will give a very subtle kind of glowing effect to those eyes. Next, it's time to do some work on the base. So we're going to start with an initial base coat of black metal from scale 75. Just cover the entire base. Just be mindful of the armor that you've just spent quite a lot of time on. So just be careful not to get it on the feet. If you do, just try and be quick. Get some water on the brush and just kind of wick it away before it dries. We're then going to do a very rough highlight with the thrash metal. Not being too careful about this. It's just to lighten the color a little bit. Again, be careful not to get it onto the blue armor, but not being too careful or too particular with this at all, to be honest. In a minute, it's all going to be covered in rust. Speaking of rust, we're now moving on to using some dirty down rust water soluble paint. If you haven't heard of this stuff, I mean, most people have heard of this stuff by now, but it's amazing. If you haven't got some, pick some up. I think originally it was designed for kind of making movie props and cosplay and that sort of thing, but I guess miniature painters got wind of it, and seems to be pretty much a staple in most people's kind of painting arsenal now. So yeah, if you haven't got some, pick some up. Really good. Just give the whole base a general base coat of this. We're also going to be giving a very light kind of stipple over all of the silver areas that we've painted. Go really careful with this because you don't really want to get it onto the armor and that sort of thing, because although it comes off with water, it will stain the underlying layer a little bit. So just try and be careful to kind of only get it in the areas where you actually want it. So the way this stuff works, if you're not already aware, is it's a water-based paint that can be reactivated with water after it's dried. So what we're doing is we're putting an initial layer on, and then what we'll do is we'll come back in with some water where we can then manipulate the paint and kind of move it to where we want it to be on the model. What I'm doing here is I'm just adding a second layer to the base, and I'm doing it quite thick because when this stuff dries, it does actually it dries quite thick. So it'll add, if you add this stippling kind of motion on top, it will add a physical texture to that base, which is something I quite like on these bases. And then what I'm doing now is I'm just taking a clean brush with some clean water on it, and I'm just going over the model, and I'm just kind of going over the edges, and I'm just kind of moving the paint around to kind of expose like the edges of that metal, just to show where the rust might have kind of worn away a little bit. And as you can see, it gives quite a nice effect. And then doing the same thing on all of the silver armor where we stippled the rust effects on. Just got some clean water on the brush, and what that's doing is that's just reactivating the paint that's already on the surface. We're not adding any extra paint here, this is just water. It's just reactivating that paint so we can manipulate it and move it around to where we want it. I'm then going to do a quick highlight on the base using heavy metal from scale 75. And I'm kind of going to do an edge highlight, but not a very neat one. So as you can see, I'm kind of stippling the edges of the metal. So I'm not doing a fine edge highlight like we did on the armor. I'm just kind of dabbing at the edges with the metal paint just to kind of simulate chipping and scratches and stuff on the floor. Then before I built this model, I added a little bit of texture paint to this base just to kind of give it a little bit of variation and add a little bit of grime to it. So just on those areas where I put the texture paint, I'm just painting that with Rhinox hide. And then going to give those areas a quick dry brush using this MIG dry brush paint. This is their chipping color, which is essentially just a light brown. And then just off camera, I've given the whole model a coat of gloss varnish through the airbrush, a couple of thin coats just to protect all that work that we've done so far before moving on to some oil washes. So I'm just going to mix up a couple of oil washes, a dark brown and a black. I'm using raw umber and ivory black oil paints. So I've just added a little bit of oil paint into each of these dishes and then added some white spirit just to mix into a thin consistency. You can kind of see on the side of the dish and on the tissue there, kind of the consistency that we're going for. So it's quite thin, and we're just going to be using this to go into all of the recesses on the model. Just remember to do that gloss varnish coat before doing this and allow it to dry properly. You might have noticed when I showed the products there that I'm using Sansador instead of white spirit. So Sansador is an artist version of white spirit, which has a slightly less strong smell, but regular white spirit does do exactly the same thing. So if you don't mind the smell of regular white spirit, just use that. It's much cheaper. And to be honest, once this bottle runs out, I probably won't be buying any more. I'll just use the regular stuff. So I'm just going to start with the black oil wash. We're basically going to be going over almost everything in all of the recesses, all over the model. Some people like to do a really precise like pin wash, but I'm not being that careful with this, to be honest. I'm just kind of putting it in the general kind of areas where the recesses are. The gloss varnish coat that we've just applied will enable us to remove it from anywhere that we don't want it to be, basically. So I'm just kind of being quite liberal with it and just try and get it into all of those recesses. As you can see, I've just pretty much put it over the entire model, and I'm just doing the base now as well. Once we're done with the black, I'm just going to switch out to the brown. There's not so much to do with this, so it's just the gold parts, the bone, the red on the shoulder pad, and then just put a little bit on the dirt on the base as well. Once you've applied all that, I'd recommend leaving it for 24 hours if you can before coming back and cleaning it up. I've been quite impatient here. I've only left it for about an hour, and then I've finished off the kind of the drying process with a hairdryer. So, but I'd recommend leaving it for kind of up to a day if you can, just to allow those oils to kind of really settle in the recesses. So I've just got a clean brush and a dish with a small amount of white spirit in it, and I'm just using that clean brush, dipping it in the white spirit, and just going over the model and just cleaning the oil paint away from the areas that we don't want. So I'm using a combination of a brush and this makeup sponge, which has been dipped in the white spirit, just to clean away that oil paint. The sponge is quite useful for the larger armor panels, and then you can use the brush to get into the smaller areas. With the white spirit on the brush, and the brush isn't saturated with it, so what I'm doing is I'm dipping the brush in the white spirit and then I'm wiping most of it off on the tissue. And what will happen is when that white spirit that's on the brush hits the oil paint that's on the model, it will reactivate the paint and it'll enable you to effectively just remove it. Thanks to that gloss varnish that we've already applied, it won't stain the underlying paint at all, and you can just clean it up exactly the way you want it and just leave the oil paint in the recesses. Just work your way around the whole model, take your time, and just keep going until it's in a place where you're happy with it. So we're almost done now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to finish cleaning up the oil paints. Then I'm going to leave it for a couple of hours just to allow those spirits to evaporate. You can see here what it looks like once the cleanup's finished. And then just off camera, once the spirits have evaporated, I'm going to give him a coat of satin varnish through the airbrush. I like to use the Vallejo Premium Satin. I think it gives a really nice finish. And then once we've done that, we'll move on to this step where we're going to add some blood effects. So I've just got an old brush here, and I've got my airbrush, which doesn't have anything in it. And I've cranked the airbrush PSI on the compressor up to pretty much as high as it'll go. I think it's at about 50 PSI. And I'm just dipping the paintbrush in the pot, holding it in front of the model, and then giving it a burst of air from the airbrush to splatter that blood effect onto the base first of all. And now I'm just doing it on the axe. So that blood on the axe is looking a little bit too bright for me. So what I've done is I've just added a tiny amount of black paint into that blood effect, just on the palette. And I'm just stippling that darker mix just over what we've done already. And it should just give a bit of variation and make it look a little bit more realistic. So all that's left to do now after this stage is to paint the base rim. I like to do mine black, and I use the Vallejo model color black. I think it gives a nice matte finish. So there we have it, all finished. This was a bit of a longer paint job this week compared to the last video, which was more of a speed paint, but I have used this exact method to paint around 4,000 or 5,000 points of Night Lords for the Horus Heresy, so it's definitely a scheme that you can replicate across an entire army. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for future videos. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments down below. I will get back to every comment. And as always, thank you for your time that you've spent watching this video. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you on the next one.